In the summer of 1914, Indians peacefully pursued the even tenor of their way. In the country, the farmer tended his stock and tilled the soil, confident of bountiful yields. In the cities, hurrying throngs bustled about their daily tasks in office, shop, and factory. The tranquil life of town and hamlet moved in leisurely sequence on its well-ordered course. Across the prairies, the golden grain fields billowed in a limitless expanse. The produce of farm and orchard ripened in abundance. Hidden wealth was being wrested from the earth's bosom. Rivers and streams floated the riches of her forests to the mills. What associations could these peace-loving Canadians possibly have with a grim tragedy enacted on a June morning in a far-off Balkan town? This little Bosnian town was early astir that fateful Sunday morning, for the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and his consort were paying Sarajevo a royal visit. As the royal procession wended its way through the narrow streets, a Bosnian student pushing through the crowd fired 2 shots, killing the royal pair instantly. To the world at large, the assassination was but another episode in the tragic story of the Habsburgs. Little did we realize that this was to prove the spark that was to set the world ablaze. To Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary, the death of his nephew and heir was another great blow heaped upon the bowed shoulders of an aged monarch whose career had been persistently dogged by tragedy. The murder, he said publicly, was not to be used to incite international antagonisms, but diplomacy nevertheless sought to implicate the Kingdom of Serbia in the drama. Now let us turn to Austria's ally, Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II was a ruler admirably suited to a proud and aggressive people. He had a passion for the top note in everything. His garish personality and flamboyant speeches were fitted to the temper of a nation obsessed with the theory of a super race and who worshipped the god of might. The military caste completely dominated Germany, and the ideals and methods of the army had permeated the national life. The lure of territorial expansion had drawn German eyes towards Asia Minor and the Orient. But Serbia blocked Germany's access to the Aegean Sea and her through connections to the east. Russia was Serbia's ally, but under the rule of the Tsar Nicholas, Russia was torn by internal strife. The Muscovite kingdom, however, was in alliance with France, each engaged to support the other in the event of war. At this critical moment in France's history, her destinies were guided by the firm hand of President Poincaré. The tragedy of Sarajevo was almost forgotten when suddenly on July the 23rd, 4 weeks after Franz Ferdinand's murder, Austria's ultimatum to Serbia came like a bolt from the blue. It demanded more than any sovereign nation could concede, short of abject surrender. Its time limit of 48 hours made peaceful negotiation impossible. For Peter of Serbia, there was but one alternative. Serbia mobilized her army. The hour of destiny had struck. On July 28th, the Emperor Franz Joseph, amid wild acclaim, declared war on his southern neighbor. King Peter appealed for aid to the Tsar Nicholas. The following day, July 29th, Russia ordered mobilization of her southern armies. On July 30th, Germany, while assembling her own forces, gave Russia 12 hours in which to cease mobilization. Russia's reply was the mobilization of her entire army. On August 1st, Germany officially ordered mobilization of her army and navy and declared war on Russia. Supporting her ally, France immediately ordered a general mobilization. Thus, in a general delirium of marching armies, of cheering citizens, and of diplomatic notes, peace forsook the world. Expelled by convulsions of anger and hatred, Europe resounded to the tread of assembling soldiers. The god of war was in the ascendant, a ruthless master who drove his victims to inexorable destruction. Germany's plan of attack against France was to turn the fortified Franco-German frontier by way of Belgium and deliver a swift blow from the northeast. Belgium, fearing the consequences of such a move, immediately ordered the mobilization of her army as a protective measure. Poor little Belgium. For 2,000 years, the cockpit of Europe, she was again destined to be the victim of Armageddon. Albert, King of the Belgians, was to win men's hearts as few kings ever win them. All his interests, like those of his people, were pacific, but when the need came, he revealed that beneath the simple exterior of this citizen king was a man cast in heroic mold, prepared to see his country laid waste and to die in the last entrenchment rather than surrender its freedom. On August the 2nd, Germany demanded free passage for her troops through Belgium. Meanwhile, her forces were converging on Liège. The same day, German troops violated the neutrality of Luxembourg. They also crossed the French frontier in the vicinity of the Vosges Mountains. Refusing Germany's demand, King Albert appealed to Great Britain for protection. Meanwhile, his small army was hurried towards the Liège forts, for this was the highway along which the Germans were advancing. The armies of France were already on the move. Garlanded with flowers, the French cavalry were acclaimed as they rode off to the front. The poilu advanced to meet his traditional enemy with gay abandon. The gaiety was soon to be silenced forever, and the garlands to wither over the graves of their bearers. Within their own memory, these verdant countrysides had been laid waste. Their richness and beauty were destined once more to be ruthlessly violated. In Britain, an anxious people awaited in agonizing suspense the word that might hurl them into the maelstrom of war. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. Berlin streets were filled with cheering crowds whose cry was, "On to Paris!" From the Mansion House steps in London, a proclamation announced general mobilization. In the House of Commons, Sir Edward Grey affirmed Britain's pledge to defend the treaty, that scrap of paper which guaranteed the neutrality of Belgium. Then came the fateful August 4th. Germany was given until midnight, Berlin time, to assure Great Britain she would respect Belgium's neutrality. In London, the hours dragged on. Germany remained silent. 11 o'clock struck. Britain was at war. Flashed through the ether, Britain's declaration of war on Germany was received in Ottawa that evening, where throngs had for hours awaited the momentous news. His Royal Highness the Governor-General received a telegraphic dispatch from the Secretary of State for the colonies at 8:45 this evening, announcing that war has broken out with Germany. Sir Robert Borden, the Prime Minister, said, "We stand shoulder to shoulder with Britain and the other British dominions in this quarrel." Canada was at war. From the national capital, the word sped eastward and westward through the night. Within 3 hours, the Parliament of Canada had been summoned to a special session. Within 24 hours, authority had been issued to raise an expeditionary force of 21,000 men. From every part of Canada, from every walk of life, came swift response. From the offices and workshops of the great cities, from the surf-beaten shores of the Maritimes, from the banks of the majestic St. Lawrence and its 100 affluents in the central provinces, from the shores of the Great Lakes, from the wheat fields of the West, from the fruitful slopes and broad acres of the Pacific coast, Canadians rallied to the call. No spirit of glory or conquest led them to forsake the peace of hearth and home for the privations and the sufferings of war. They were free men, dominated by the simple resolve to offer life itself in defense of their ideals. At this supreme moment, at the helm of Canada's military affairs, was that dynamic patriot, Colonel Sam Hughes. In a few days, troop trains were thundering across the continent towards the mobilization point, Valcartier. In little more than 2 weeks after the declaration of war, the plain of Valcartier, almost virgin wilderness, had been transformed as if by magic into a great military camp. Not 20,000, but nearly 40,000 men assembled there. To organize and equip this host was a Herculean task, but it was achieved with amazing speed. Units were shuffled and reshuffled into battalions and brigades. Training proceeded with energy and enthusiasm. Additional to troops raised by the government, several units were raised and financed by private citizens. Among them was the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Membership in its ranks was confined to veterans of previous campaigns. On Sunday, August the 23rd, in Lansdowne Park, Ottawa, the colors of this splendid regiment were dedicated. Following the dedication ceremonies, the Princess Patricia of Connaught, daughter of the then Governor-General, presented the colors, which she had worked with her own hands, to the regiment which bore her name. 6 weeks after the declaration of war, a contingent of 33,000 men was ready to proceed overseas. On September the 26th, began the movement of troops from Valcartier to Quebec. Embarkation was completed in 8 days. As each troop ship was loaded, it steamed down the St. Lawrence to a rendezvous in Gaspé Basin. On October the 3rd, 1914, in 3 lines extending for many miles, the Armada, escorted by British warships, headed into the Atlantic en route for England and the war. It bore the largest army that up to that time had ever crossed the ocean. "11 days later, the first of the transports arrived off Plymouth Sound. As each unit disembarked, it was entrained for Salisbury Plain. On the sodden lands of West Down North, West Down South, the Bustard, Larks Hill, Ponds Farm, and Sling Plantation, in the cold and the rain and the mud, the Canadians displayed that great endurance which later proved their quality in France and Flanders. Command of the Canadian Division was given to General E.A.H. Alderson, a distinguished British soldier. Training was rigorous, and in spite of their privations and exposure, the Canadians carried out their duties with good heart. Day after day, they were exercised in the arts of war. And what of the motherland? In London, throngs had congregated in front of Buckingham Palace, pledging themselves to this grim business of war. Late in July, the Royal Navy, assembled for its annual review by Britain's Sailor King, had been retained at its stations. So ominously had the war clouds loomed. The regular army was not unprepared. Though small in numbers, it was well trained, well equipped, efficient, and mobile. The Territorial Army, corresponding to our own militia, was for the most part in summer camp at the outbreak of war. On August 5th, Lord Kitchener of Khartoum was appointed Secretary of State for War. Plans already existed for the swift dispatch of an overseas expeditionary force, and no sooner did the order for mobilization go forth than from every corner of the kingdom, Britain's fighting forces were quickly assembling. Naval reservists, called from their post-service vocations, hurried to rejoin their ships. Veterans of Britain's older wars returned to the colors. Those still on the reserve once more found themselves marching to the old familiar music. Eager citizens thronged to the recruiting offices. Meanwhile, the first divisions of the regular army, the immortal Old Contemptibles, were en route to France. In command of the British Expeditionary Force was General Sir John French, who had won high distinction in the South African War 14 years before. And so by the third week of August, the old Contemptibles were trudging through the elm-bordered avenues of northern France. They sang as they marched, and their song was not of war and glory, but an absurd ditty from the London Music Hall.
It's a long way to go, it's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there.
Marching to meet them was the flower of the German army. The peace of this quiet Sunday was shattered when on the horizon a phalanx of field gray figures appeared, advancing across the meadows north of Mons. Though vastly outnumbered, the British held their ground with the same coolness and courage as their forefathers at Waterloo 100 years before. Threats of envelopment, however, compelled them to withdraw, and there began one of the greatest episodes of British military history, the retreat from Mons. Day after day, the old Contemptibles turned like some desperate terrier at bay to snap viciously at the pursuing hordes, fighting to the last man with dauntless heroism. But day after day, night after night, the heartbreaking retirement continued, leg-weary, heart-sick, disconsolate, but still with courage unimpaired, the remnant of the brave little army shuffled backward. And then the Marne. The tide was turned, the enemy was hurled back. These were days when the whole British nation responded to the call of arms. Kitchener's army was in the making. Eager citizens thronged to offer themselves for their country's service. City and town reverberated to the tread of new battalions. Nationally prominent men everywhere harangued enthusiastic crowds, while robust and spirited youths drilled for the day when they too would be thrown into the cauldron of war. Equally significant events were taking place afloat, but first news of naval action was depressing. On November 1st, a small British squadron in command of Sir Christopher Craddock, cruising off Coronel on the west coast of South America, encountered a squadron of 5 fast cruisers under Admiral von Spee. In the ensuing action, which saw them outnumbered by a superior force of speedier ships, the British fought with a spirit that upheld all the glorious traditions of the Royal Navy, but it was a hopelessly gallant effort. First, the flagship Good Hope was sunk. Shortly afterwards, the Monmouth went down, fighting bravely to the last. In this battle, several Canadian officers and midshipmen lost their lives. But swift retribution was soon to overtake the victorious Germans. Rear Admiral Sir Doveton Sturdy was given command of a special squadron, and with 2 of Britain's most formidable battle cruisers, the Invincible and the Inflexible, he left to hunt down von Spee. At a rendezvous off the coast of Brazil, they were joined by the South Atlantic Squadron. Anticipating that von Spee would round Cape Horn to attack the Falkland Islands, Sturdy headed his squadron southward with all speed. and arrived at Port Stanley on December the 7th. His guess was right. The next morning, as his ships were coaling, a German squadron was sighted approaching the port. The British immediately cleared for action. HMS Canopus fired the opening guns. The surprised Germans, who had expected to find the fort undefended, turned and fled. In a short time, the British squadron were steaming full speed on the heels of the fleeing Germans. Within 3 hours, the British were within range of the enemy ships. A running fight ensued, the enemy ships seeking desperately to elude and outmaneuver the British. But this time the tables were turned. The Germans fought with great gallantry, but the guns and marksmanship of the British were overwhelmingly superior. One by one, the enemy cruisers, masses of tangled wreckage, were sunk. Thus was Coronel avenged. In the North Sea, the vigilance of the Royal Navy had practically held the German high seas fleet to its harbors and forced restriction of its activities to occasional swift raids on the British coast. To carry out one of these raids, a German squadron left Wilhelmshaven on the night of January 23rd, 1915. But the British Admiralty was able to foretell this stroke. And from the Firth of Forth, a battle cruiser squadron left at dawn on the 24th to intercept them. The fleet was commanded by Vice Admiral Sir David Beatty. A few hours later, the two fleets met off the Dogger Bank. In the engagement that followed, the British gunnery wreaked havoc on the enemy ships. And now we present one of the most unique and dramatic scenes ever recorded by a motion picture camera, the end of a great enemy battleship. Torpedoed, see her keeling over, her crew desperately scrambling over her sloping decks. She capsizes. The hapless sailors clamber over her hull. Hundreds are hurtled into the sea. Others cling like flies to the swaying, sinking hulk. The sea is dotted with frantic, swimming men. Some are picked up by rescuing boats. Hopelessly, a few still cling to the sinking hull. The ship disappears. 1,000 lives are lost. We return now to Salisbury Plain, where, their harrowing experience of the bitter winter at an end, the Canadian contingent early in February passed in review before His Majesty the King. Thoroughly efficient in every respect, the Canadians were dispatched to take their place in the battle line of northern France. On February the 11th, 1915, our immortal 1st contingent landed at Saint-Nazaire, France. What soldier will ever forget that mystic symbol? 40 men or 8 horses. In the raw winter days of February, they trudged northward for their first experience of trench warfare towards Armentières. That experience was far from comforting, but it inured the troops to the privations which followed. The first contingent were now all in the trenches. Early in April, the Canadians left Armentières. Their route was northward to that area now hallowed with their name, Ypres, the wipers of the immortal old contemptibles. This historic Flemish city, with its age-old ramparts and its ancient cloth hall, had suffered bombardments from early in the war, but when the Canadians first saw it, Ypres was not badly damaged. Having clung to their homes throughout the winter, many of its despairing inhabitants were now daily abandoning the doomed city. As each Canadian unit arrived in the Ypres area, it was inspected by the Army Commander, Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, who had commanded the Canadians in South Africa 14 years before. The Ypres salient was a source of weakness to its defenders, but its retention was vital, for it was the key to the Channel ports. On April 17th, the Canadians relieved French troops in shallow and insecure trenches about 6 miles northeast of Ypres. Their line extended for 2.5 miles from Gravenstaffel to the Ypres-Polkapelle road. On their left were French colonials, on the right were the British. April 22nd found them occupied in the usual duties of trench life, carefully observing enemy movements and laboring hard to strengthen their position. As the day advanced, a heavy bombardment deluged the town of Ypres, and terrified civilians were seen thronging down the roads from the stricken city, carrying with them such of their belongings as they could hastily gather together. War in all its merciless ferocity had descended on these innocent people, mere pawns in this heartless conflict. They were the sufferers with whom fate dealt most harshly. Towards dusk, from the German trenches, hostile activity became intensified. The cannonade developed into drum fire. Huge shells rended the earth with deafening explosions, rocking the Ypres ridges and bursting with volcanic fury. Meanwhile, in the German trenches, preparations were hastily being completed for the introduction into warfare of a newer and more devilish agency of death, poison gas. At 5 p.m., a green cloud was seen drifting across no man's land. In its wake came the enemy masses. The line to the left of the Canadians, held by the French colonials, was overwhelmed in the first onrush. The enemy penetrated far into the Canadian flank. With the Germans all around them, the Canadians fought with stubborn bravery, repelling attack after attack. The German advances carried them to the very muzzles of the Canadian field guns. At point-blank range, the artillery and machine gunners fought desperately back. The fighting continued throughout the night, but the Canadian front line held intact. At midnight, the 10th and 16th battalions made their immortal charge through Kitchener's Wood. At daylight on April 24th, poison gas was projected on the Canadian line and the enemy attacked. Their lungs seared, choking and gasping, the Canadians staggered to man their parapets. Ordered to withdraw to a new line, the Canadians retired, contesting every inch of the way. The new line held. The salient was narrowed, but Ypres was still secure. Canada had saved the day. From Ypres, the brave and exhausted remnant of the Canadian Division were withdrawn, but with only a few days' respite, were thrown into the battles of Passchendaele and Givenchy. Since the Battle of the Dogger Bank, the Royal Navy had kept the German fleet bottled up in the Kiel Canal. The enemy, however, conceived a new plan. If their navy could not retaliate on the sea, it could underneath. Submarines, evading watchful surface patrols, could surprise and prey unseen upon shipping. Thus, early in 1915, began the submarine campaign, which was destined to horrify and anger the whole civilized world. Declaring a blockade of the British Isles, the enemy initiated unrestricted submarine warfare against both Allied and neutral shipping. It is a curious fact that many U-boats even carried cameras with which to record their successes. Yes, their successes. Peaceful, defenseless vessels sinking on the desolate wastes of the ocean, carrying with them to a watery grave their helpless freight of human lives. This also is war. Then came the Lusitania. These are the last pictures of the giant Cunarder leaving New York on May 1st, 1915. 6 days later, the huge liner was torpedoed without warning off the Irish coast. She sank and carried to their death over 1,000 men, women, and children. On May 23rd, 1915, Italy joined the Allies. King Victor Emmanuel, although peacefully inclined, could not restrain the clamor of his people. When war came, ending as it did Italy's unnatural 30 years alliance with the Central Powers, it was received with riotous enthusiasm. The Italian army, already mobilized, was hastened to the eastern frontier, to the high altitude of the Alps. In a region of eternal snow, the Italian soldiers, equipped with skis, made their own trails down these white mountain slopes. With the 1st Canadian Division recovering from its sacrifices of the spring and early summer, the 2nd Division was being organized in England. On September the 2nd, 1915, prior to its departure for France, the 2nd Division was reviewed at Beechborough Park near Folkestone by His Majesty the King and Lord Kitchener. Command of the division had been vested in Major General R.E.W. Turner, V.C. On the White Charger is Lord Kitchener. Within a year, while on a secret mission to Russia, he was drowned off the Shetland Islands when HMS Hampshire was sunk. His manner of passing was as mysterious as the mission on which he went. Like the 1st Division, the 2nd, within a few months, was to pass through the fires in the Ypres area. Its great gallantry during the crater fighting at St. Eloi was to bring it lasting renown. As His Majesty wended his way from the review, he was greeted by wounded veterans of the 1st Division, with whom he chatted and to whom he gave a word of good cheer. In the early summer of 1915, following Festubert and Givenchy, the Canadians were transferred to Plugestiert, known to the soldiers as Plug Street. The trenches lay in the valley of the Deuve River, below Messines Ridge, a sodden quagmire which offered virtually no protection from either enemy shelling or sniping. So little was the cover offered by the communication trenches, and such was their condition, that men commonly took great chances ducking over the open. In Plug Street, the men's activities were confined chiefly to improving their surroundings and making existence a little more livable. As the official communiques had it, all was quiet on the Western Front. Torrential rains in the early fall added to the discomforts of a life already far from comfortable. Trenches collapsed, shelters crumpled, and became masses of sodden debris. Yet amid surroundings such as these, men ate, slept, and existed, and preserved a cheerfulness that would not be suppressed, and so passed the winter of 1915. Meanwhile, the 3rd Canadian Division was created, battalions which, unattached to the 2 older divisions, had undergone the rigors of war, were merged into this splendid formation, command of which was given to Major General M.S. Mercer. The spring of 1916 saw the Canadian Corps back in the Ypres salient. They found Ypres a devastated heap of debris. The famous cloth hall, practically untouched a year before, was now a mass of rubble, its art treasures utterly destroyed, its walls crumbling. This formerly perfect specimen of medieval architecture had been blasted to utter ruin. As Ypres had witnessed the baptism of fire of the 1st Division, so also was it to be the terrain on which the 3rd Division acquired deathless fame. At this time, General Sir Julian Byng succeeded General Alderson in command of the Canadian Corps. On June 2nd, 1916, the Germans attacked the 3rd Division at Sanctuary Wood. The Canadian line was pressed back, but 10 days later, a brilliant counterattack recaptured much of the lost ground. This tortured landscape, with its blasted tree trunks, its churned up earth, and its general spectacle of ruin and desolation, is Sanctuary Wood, immortalized by the valor of the 3rd Division. For days and nights, death had rained down on the Canadians. One whole brigade was almost annihilated. Here General Mercer met his death and was succeeded by Major General L.R. Lipsett. And here on the fringe of Sanctuary Wood were 2 sacrifice guns of the 2nd Brigade Canadian Field Artillery, manned by those intrepid volunteer crews who, knowing death to be inevitable, fought their guns to the last. While these events were passing in France, Canada had been preparing to reinforce the 3 divisions in the field by a 4th. Early in June 1916, His Majesty the King, accompanied by Field Marshal Lord French and Major General David Watson, reviewed the division just prior to its being dispatched to France. Scarcely had the echoes of the Ypres fighting subsided when a new battle opened, this time in Picardy. On July 1st, 1916, the British and French launched the great offensive that became known as the Battles of the Somme. Late in July, the Canadians were withdrawn from Ypres to training areas near Saint-Omer. There they were visited by their Minister of Militia, Sir Sam Hughes, before they were sent to play their part in this new battle. The third week of August saw the Canadians en route to the Somme. Who can forget the town of Albert and its shell-torn basilica surmounted by the hanging Virgin? Local legend had it that when the figure fell, the war would end. Strangely enough, a shell toppled the statue from its eminence in the last offensive which ended the war. Accustomed only to the meager munition supplies of the past, the Canadians were amazed at the apparently inexhaustible stores of shells, bombs, and engineering material that met their eyes on every side at the Somme. On August 31st, they began relief of the Australians on Vimy Ridge and became acquainted with the jagged rubble heap of La Boiselle. A preliminary attack on September the 9th had for its object the capture of a portion of Vimy Ridge which still remained in the enemy's hands. The assault, delivered without the usual intense artillery barrage, was executed with boldness and rapidity and was completely successful. At this time, a new and fearful engine of war, the tank, was introduced to the Western Front. Such secrecy had surrounded these steel-clad land ships that their existence was unknown, except to a few, until they appeared in the battle area. On September 14th, preliminary to the offensive better known to Canadians as the Battle of Courcelette, the artillery opened up a terrific bombardment on the German positions, which continued throughout the day and night. Hour after hour, a torrent of shells descended upon the enemy trenches and back areas, tearing them to shreds. Under cover of darkness, both infantry and tanks were moved forward to assembly areas. These enormously heavy steel-clad monsters were designed to crush down barbed wire entanglements and machine gun emplacements, thus making it easier for the infantry to advance. At 6:20 on the morning of September 15th, a barrage of great intensity crashed down upon the enemy's front line and supports. At the same time, the Canadian infantry sprang from their trenches to the attack. Accompanying the infantry, the tanks lumbered over no man's land, looming out over the battle smoke with death vomiting from their machine guns. German machine gunners sprayed the steel sides of these monsters to no purpose. Relentlessly, the tanks crumpled the enemy emplacements and pursued their ungainly course over masses of debris. In successive lines, the Canadians advanced, suffering many casualties, but going on unwaveringly. Unable further to resist the combination of tanks, bombardment, and determined infantry, hundreds of Germans surrendered, running back to the Canadian lines. Within an hour, the Canadians had stormed the famous sugar refinery, had gone beyond, and were hurriedly digging in. Supporting battalions hastened forward to press the attack. In front of the sugar refinery lay what remained of Courcelette, defended by deep trenches and concrete strong points. the Canadian guns resumed their bombardment of the village. At 6 o'clock in the evening, as the sun was sinking behind the heights of the Ancre, the infantry once more went over the top. Undaunted by machine gunning and shell fire, they plunged down the deadly slope, carrying the enemy positions at the point of the bayonet. They dashed through the village and its maze of sunken roads to the ridge beyond. Courcelette was won. The village itself was a ruin. Dead men lay everywhere. War is not a glorious thing. This is war. These were once men. From the inferno through which they had passed, wounded men limped or were carried back to the field dressing station. There, enmity vanishing in the common affliction, like treatment was meted out to all. The ministrations of the men on whose arm was the brassard of the Red Cross belonged to the little sung heroisms of the war. Their skill in first aid, their tireless energies, their anxiety to ensure to their comrades that initial service on which so much life depended, and the bravery which saw them on their errand of mercy amid the death and desolation of the battlefield were relieving elements in a war that was ruthless and merciless. Prisoners were numerous. As quickly as they could be assembled, they were sent to the rear. Scarcely a day passed, but saw its procession of prisoners through the streets of Albert on their way to concentration camps, far back of the line. For them, the war was over, and few were sorry. After Courcelette, the weather broke. Rain, rain, rain. Each day saw the squalor and misery of the troops intensified. Soaked in water and mud, men existed under conditions that beggar description. All the elements arrayed themselves against further efforts, but while operations were retarded, they did not cease. Zollern Trench, Babeck Graben, Canora Trench, Regina Trench, there was a distressing similarity about them all. The dawn ushered in by the roll of gunfire, the shriek and whine of the barrage, the shells tearing into the tortured earth. And through this tornado of death, the Canadians grimly strove and struggled forward to capture and hold a few more yards of enemy trench. Late in November, the Canadians commenced their move northward from the Somme to Vimy Ridge, where they were to spend the winter. On the sea, Germany had intensified her unrestricted submarine warfare against all shipping. Unarmed and defenseless merchantmen were being torpedoed without warning, their crews abandoned to their fate. Neutral ships, unmistakably identified, were ruthlessly blown up and sent to the bottom regardless of human life. Even hospital ships were not immune. But Britain's sea dogs rose to the occasion and met the challenge. Destroyers patrolled the seas in regular relays, ever watchful for the telltale periscope. Merchant vessels were carefully convoyed through the danger zone. Not only on the sea, but in the air, eternal vigilance was maintained against the U-boat. speedy destroyers equipped with special apparatus for detecting the presence of submarines combed the sea. When a submerged U-boat was located, the destroyers circled the area, dropping depth charges, and thus accounted for many a hostile submarine. An oil spot on the surface of the sea tells its own tale. Then came the mystery ships, old and bedraggled-looking vessels manned by personnel of the Royal Navy, cruised in submarine-infested seas to lure the U-boats into shelling or torpedoing them. When the submarine halted the mystery ship, part of the crew, known as the panic party, launched the boats and pulled away, with all evidence of abandoning ship. The remainder stayed on board, silent and invisible. Having come to the surface, the submarine would approach the seemingly hapless vessel to deliver the final blow. Out broke the white ensign. Cleverly concealed guns were swung into action, and the fight was on. Britain's Q ships, as they were termed, accounted for many a German commerce raider. The United States had suffered heavily from Germany's submarine campaign. All protests by President Woodrow Wilson had been ignored. At last, the patience of the American people was exhausted. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Division of American troops, the nucleus of the vast army that was later to proceed overseas, was dispatched to France almost immediately. General John J. Pershing, an officer of great distinction, was in command. Spring on Vimy Ridge brought all the harbingers of another offensive. New roads had to be constructed throughout the entire area. The work proceeded in a fashion familiar to Canadian eyes. Railway lines were pushed forward with amazing rapidity. The story of the Canadian railway troops is one of the romances of the war, how one battalion of 500 men grew into a corps of over 14,000. In the spring of 1917, they took a major part in the construction and maintenance of a vast network of railways extending along the whole western front. Huge dumps of ammunition were accumulated everywhere. Supplies and ammunition were carried to the front areas on these railways. It had been clearly revealed that this was the most adequate means of pushing forward the enormous quantities of material necessary for a modern battle. Much of the labor was performed by troops of the British West Indies Regiment, who had an amiable indifference to the danger of handling shells roughly. These soldiers, at least, found the war très bonne. When you can't see over a ridge, the best expedient is to get as high up as you can and then take a look. Such was the job of the observation balloon section. And so, seated in his basket, the observer sees the country lying as a map before him. Thus is he able to report enemy movements and observe artillery fire. One of the duties of the Royal Flying Corps was to screen these balloons from enemy aircraft. But sometimes a hostile plane got through. Then the observer had no choice but to bail out. With tracer bullets, the enemy airman sets fire to the huge gas bag. A roaring, seething furnace, the balloon sinks heavily to the ground. Only a few remnants of blazing material fall hissing to the earth. Plans for the capture of Vimy Ridge were worked out during the winter by General Sir Julian Byng and his staff. They were thorough. Near Lillers, a huge relief map, a miniature of the whole Vimy Ridge area, was laid out, and there for weeks in advance of the attack, officers and other ranks were instructed in great detail on every phase of the coming operation. In rear areas, the ground was taped out, and across these tapes, the troops trained in their part of the battle until they were letter perfect. Heavy guns of all calibers were moved into position. Large quantities of supplies were borne forward by an exclusively Canadian innovation, the tump line, first used extensively at this stage. In the front line, preparations for the attack proceeded. The bombardment of Vimy Ridge began the first week of April. Day after day and night after night, a veritable avalanche of shells descended upon the ridge. The Allies now began to assert an ascendancy in artillery, which up to this point had been with the Germans. This 12-inch naval gun was only one of many calibers employed to smash the German defenses and to turn the whole ridge into an inferno, to search out enemy ammunition stores and railway centers far behind the German positions. On April 8, 1917, was Easter Sunday. It was bright and sunny. In the forenoon, battalions held their church parades, as was their wont. As the day advanced, the Canadians swung out of their billets and trudged along the white roads that led to Vimy. Here was to be a supreme test of the Canadian Corps. Additional ammunition was distributed as the troops proceeded forward. And as night fell, the transports with all the loads of material necessary to consolidate rumbled towards the ridge. In the forward trenches, the infantrymen worked and waited. Intense gunfire continued throughout the night until 0 hour, 5 a.m., April 9th. Then, in one great chorus of deafening explosion, the greatest mass of guns so far concentrated on the Western Front belched their shrieking missiles onto Vimy Ridge. Flaming heralds of death tore viciously into the earth, rending it with devastating fury. The infantry leaped from their trenches and the great attack began. All 4 Canadian divisions swept forward in line. Through a snowstorm, the Canadians plowed across no man's land into the enemy trenches. Enemy machine guns tore through them, but with little heed to conditions or casualties, the Canadians pressed on. The German forward defenses were quickly stormed. Stretcher bearers followed rapidly on the heels of the advancing troops. The long lines of Canadians moved ahead. Commandant's House, Talus, La Folie Farm, all fell to the victorious onrush. The light artillery, now outranged, galloped forward to seek new positions on the ridge itself. Dotted here and there over the immense battleground were the silent witnesses to the toll of war. As the advance continued, wounded men, elated over the progress of the attack, staggered back to the field dressing station. Here they were cared for by their medical officers and rapidly dispatched to the casualty clearing stations farther behind the line. Loaded on the trench tramways, the battle-stricken were speedily transported from the danger zone. With machine-like precision, the attacking waves swept on, up over the crest of Vimy, on to their final objective. Vimy Ridge was won. Later to be known as Lord Byng of Vimy, the corps commander was soon promoted, and his successor was Canada's great leader and citizen soldier, Arthur William Currie. Following the fighting at Arleux, Fresnoy, and Hill 70, October 1917 saw the Canadians moving again to Ypres, this time to Passchendaele. Of Passchendaele, men remember only the mud, the interminable shelling and bombing, and the heartbreaking attacks. But chiefly when Canadians talk of Passchendaele, they talk of evil-smelling mud and slime, which clung to them and exuded the stench of dead things. What trenches existed were merely waterlogged ditches. Men had to dig their cover in muddy shell holes. Supply-laden vehicles became bogged on roads that were veritable quagmires. This added to the privations of the troops dependent upon them. It tested men's grit to the utmost. Guns had to be manhandled laboriously into positions in which they quickly sank to their axles. Ammunition and rations had to be brought forward on pack animals. For weeks, the Canadians fought through these swamps, heaping up casualties. How men lived, let alone in this desolation, has only one answer. They captured Passchendaele. For 3.5 years, war in all its madness and butchery had convulsed the tortured world. War in which men used every artifice the mind could devise to kill and maim their fellows. War in which the corpses of men, in whose veins once had flowed the sweet red wine of youth, lay foul and rotting on the fields of the world. 3.5 years, and the end was not yet. Preparing through the winter for a final overpowering onslaught, Germany had assembled her veteran troops on the Western Front under von Hindenburg and Ludendorff. On March 21st, the enemy launched the first of a series of crushing attacks on that Allied line which extended from the North Sea to Switzerland, striving to divide the British and French armies near St. Quentin. A week later, a second great offensive was delivered against the British north of the Somme. The Allied cause was in peril. At Doullens, on March 26th, a historic conference was held between Marshals Pétain and Foch. President Poincaré, Georges Clemenceau, the aged French premier, Sir Douglas Haig, Sir Henry Wilson, and Lord Milner. Marshal Foch emerged from this meeting commander-in-chief of the Allied armies. On April 9th, a third hammer blow fell on the British south of Ypres. Ground was yielded, but not without a struggle. On April 11th, appeared Sir Douglas Haig's famous Order of the Day. There is no other course open to us but to fight it out. Every position must be held to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one must fight on to the end. blows of this terrific series were directed against the French in the Champagne on May 27th, followed later by two more in the same region. The French fell back, fighting desperately. Meanwhile, American troops in increasing numbers had landed in France to take their place by the side of the war-weary and sorely pressed Allies. Flying Corps had once more regained its supremacy in the air. The outdated machines of 1914 and early 1915 had been succeeded by swift fighting planes well adapted to the quick combat maneuvers which were vital in aerial warfare. Varying fortunes had attended the battles for this supremacy. Each side strove to outdo the other in the invention of new devices and new tactics. On the Somme in 1916, the British had first obtained the upper hand. The early months of 1917, however, saw the Germans employing faster machines, which for a while eclipsed those of the British. By the fall of 1917, this situation had again become reversed, nor did the Royal Flying Corps ever again yield its domination of the skies. Bombing of railways, of ammunition and supply stores, of troop concentrations and hostile airdromes far in rear of the front lines were among the perilous duties performed by the airmen. These lone prowlers of the upper air sought each other out and in the eternal vastness of space fought their battles to the end. Bullets ripping into some vulnerable part, a helpless swaying plane would spiral to the earth. Beyond control, its doom inevitable, the machine would crash to the ground. A flaming tangle of wreckage. Its pilot dead. War in the air was the particular sphere of adventurous, carefree youth. Canadians were among its most ardent exponents. More than 8,000 of them served in the Royal Flying Corps. Bishop, Barker, Collishaw, McLaren, McLean, these were famous names in the flying tradition. By the middle of 1918, the single combats had been succeeded by mass fighting in the air. Not two, but sometimes 20 and more planes would sweep down through the skies, engaging, circling, darting away and returning in a type of air battle known among pilots as a dogfight. Fluttering like a wounded bird, some unfortunate would fall out of the fight, a blazing wreck. Miraculously, a few would escape death, but this one did not. Combatants were not the sole victims of air warfare. Loaded with death-dealing missiles, German bombing planes flew by night far over the Allied lines on missions of destruction. The bombing of a hospital filled with wounded and the slaughter of 21 disabled, helpless men and nurses at Ypres in May 1918 was one of the most sickening episodes of a war already filled with horror. Ghastly, pitiless, diabolical, but that too is war. last post sounds its solemn requiem. The ministering angels of the sick and the wounded, war spares no one. It was one of the strange anomalies of the war that with savage conflicts raging all around them, the Canadians were scarcely involved. On Dominion Day 1918, the skirl of massed pipe band ushered in one of the most wonderful meets in the history of athletics. The locale was Tank, within sight of Vimy Ridge and within sound of the guns. His Royal Highness the Duke of Connaught and the Right Honourable Sir Robert Borden, Canada's Prime Minister, were present to cheer the soldier athletes. Over 40,000 soldiers were present to witness the game. Well, the 2nd Division won that, did they? Sir Henry Burstall, the divisioner commander, seems quite pleased. The famous Dumbells played to capacity audiences in their open-air theatre at every performance, and these were continuous. Early in August, the Canadians received orders to move from the Arras area. At country crossroads, far removed from the riot of war, they were loaded into motor lorries and whisked away to an unknown destination, not knowing whither they were bound and caring less. Disembarking, they were marched into the heavily wooded country southeast of Amiens. And there, in the concealment of the trees, they awaited the order to send them forward. Under cover of night, they moved to their final assembly areas, extending from near Villers, Bretonneau on the north to near Moreuil on the south. The misty dawn of August 8th was shattered asunder at 4:20 a.m. as hundreds of guns suddenly and without any preliminary warning crashed out a thundering, death-dealing chorus. The roar shook the earth. Thousands of shells screamed through the air to deluge the enemy's trenches. The infantry abandoned their sodden positions and leaped to the attack, taking the enemy completely by surprise. Many tanks accompanied them. The assault progressed through Hangared Wood and up the valley of the Luce River, across the ridges of Marcel Cave. Tanks and infantry advanced. Now out of range due to the rapidity of the advance, the field artillery galloped forward and from open positions continued a heavy fire. The thunder of galloping horses heralded the arrival of the cavalry to pursue the fleeing enemy. The black day of the German army was what Ludendorff termed this fight. Black it was on those fields which, dotted with dead men, belied the cheerfulness of the summer sun. Sunset found the Canadians on their objective. From their original line, the Canadians had advanced 8 miles, the greatest penetration made in any single day's fighting up to that time. August 9th saw a further advance of nearly 6 miles. In the succeeding week, the line was pushed forward to the outskirts of Roye and Chaulnes. Every battlefront was now in conflagration. From the North Sea to the Alps, the big drive of the Allies had begun. Regarded by the Germans as impregnable, the Drocourt-Quéant switch line and the Hindenburg defenses were the last words in wire entanglements and concrete dugouts. They were the result of years of labor, and they incorporated every element of protection. But on September the 2nd, the Canadian Corps delivered its 6th major assault in less than 4 weeks, sweeping on through Dury and Cagnicourt to the last obstacle that protected Cambrai, the Canal du Nord. In this action, great captures of German prisoners were made. Significant was the extreme youth of many of them, mere schoolboys who had no place whatever in this dreadful Holocaust. In less than 2 weeks, the Canadians had advanced to the Canal du Nord within 8-mile city of Cambrai. The Canal du Nord, a formidable obstacle. Yet on September the 27th, the Canadians, crossing on a front of 1.5 miles, stormed the canal and the heights of Bourlon. By nightfall, they had fanned out to a front of nearly 10 miles and were sweeping on towards Cambrai. When Canadian patrols entered Cambrai on the morning of October 9th, they found it a burning shell. The German rear guards, before finally evacuating the city, had set it on fire in many places. One of the incendiaries, who waited too long, fell into the hands of this patrol. To extinguish the fires was the work of the Canadian engineers. They worked hard and long to keep the blaze from spreading. Their efforts were successful, and although various of the city were ruined, others were saved. what significance the Allies placed upon the wanton destruction of Cambrai is emphasized by the visit paid to its ruins by Clemenceau, the old tiger of France, accompanied by Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, British Commander-in-Chief. They inspected the ruins of the famous city for themselves. With the smoking ruins of Cambrai in the background, the Canadians pushed rapidly on. Their next objective, Valenciennes. On the northern flank, the Canadians advanced unopposed through towns whose liberated populations were delirious with joy. Denain was the next sizable town to be freed. As the troops entered the suburbs, they were acclaimed as conquerors. Impressive ceremonies accompanied the liberation. His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, then attached to the Canadian Corps, was the center of a tumultuous welcome. He was accompanied by Generals Curry, Morrison, and Watson. And now it can be told as a solemn fact that the beautiful bouquet of flowers which this charming mademoiselle has just presented to the prince had only a few minutes before been chewed up by a goat. The 4th Division lads will remember that. The liberation of Denain stands out as a highlight in the history of the Canadian Corps. The review and march past were of course inevitable. To the citizens, a magnificent spectacle. To the poor blooming infantry, just another blinking parade. On November 1st, Valenciennes fell. Canadian patrols venturing across the makeshift bridges over the canal entered the suburbs. The city itself was untouched, but its southern outskirts were in ruins, and dead men lay in the streets. God punish England. The whole world was being punished. Still pursuing the retiring enemy, all arms moved forward. In Valenciennes, the Canadian soldiers found time to indulge their curiosity to the full. They searched diligently for souvenirs, and they found them. Well, where do we go from here? 3 temporary gentlemen in a 1918 model streamlined one-man power roadster deluxe, off on a sightseeing tour. What? No gas and not a petrol dump in sight. What a war. Supplies for the liberated civilians were rushed forward, a square meal at last, for some, the first in 4 years. 4 years of thraldom. No wonder those fair citizens of Valenciennes smiled as they posed for their photograph. The long martyrdom of their city was over. They were again free. The arrival of President Poincaré at Valenciennes was a notable occasion. Clemenceau had seen the wreck of Cambrai. Poincaré beheld Valenciennes. His congratulations to the civic authorities were voiced on behalf of all France. His thanks to Sir Henry Horne, commander of the liberating First Army, were sincere and deep. From Arras to Valenciennes, the Canadians had fought hard and bloody battles. As they pursued the enemy towards Mons, their course was less costly. In the early morning of November the 11th, the troops of the 3rd Canadian Division marched through Mons on the heels of their patrols, who had flitted like wraiths through the sleeping city during the night. Mons, although its associations were historic, was scarcely touched by war's destructive hand. Its buildings and homes had been spared the devastation that had laid waste Ypres, Arras, and Cambrai. East of the city, the Canadian patrols continued to push forward to that final line where the war was to end. From battalion headquarters, the incredible news was rushed to the soldiers in the front line. The war was over. The war was over. No wonder men cheered and sang. The hardships, the suffering, the horrible frightfulness of it all were at an end. The whole world rejoiced. Canadians established an unbreakable link with Mons. Here General Horn held his memorable review immediately following the armistice. The 5th Lancers, last to leave Mons in August 1914, were given the place of honor. In this stirring pageant, they headed the parade. It was at Mons the war began. What horrors, what tragedy, what sacrifice, what bloodshed, anguish and misery, since those valiant old contemptibles had marched cheerfully through the shady avenues of France on their way to Mons 4 years before. With gaiety in their stout hearts and a song on their lips, the old contemptibles were now only a memory, a sad, glorious memory. Other men had taken their places. Another army now swung through these storied streets of Mons. Men who had fought with the same devoted bravery for the same ideals, men who proudly bore the emblem of their homeland, Canada. Then began the march to Germany. Preceded by the cavalry, the veteran 1st and 2nd Canadian Divisions continued on to take their place in the Army of Occupation. On December 4th, led by Sir Arthur Currie and General A.C. MacDonell, commander of the 1st Division, the Canadians crossed the German frontier at the village of Poteau. The Corps commander took the salute as the main body marched through this little hamlet from Belgium into Germany. On December 13th, the Canadians reached the ancient city of Cologne. Here, the 1st Division crossed the Rhine. And in the center of the bridge stood General Sir Herbert Plumer, their army commander, taking the salute. The 2nd Division crossed at Bonn, 20 miles up the river. As they marched across the ornate bridge from Bonn to Boyle, the Corps commander gave them their final inspection, their final review. Here, to all intents and purposes, was the high water mark and the end of the Canadian Corps. At Versailles, on June 28, 1919, the world statesman decreed peace. Peace, but at what a cost? Though the clash of armed forces had ceased, the peoples of the world were to suffer war's aftermath for many years to come. In Canada itself, we were to carry a burden of sorrow and of taxation that was to continue on through generations yet unborn. Peace to a world reddened with the slaughter, the chaos, the desolation, and the suffering of 4 frenzied years. Millions of human lives destroyed. Millions of human bodies broken. Millions more of innocent people left homeless and destitute. For what? Cities can be rebuilt. The tortured landscape can blossom again. But our dead cannot return to us. A war to end war. Was it? For the answer, search your own heart.